Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. Recently, a viewer asked a question in the comment section to one of my videos. What caused you to be so interested in Chinese culture? And I gave a very brief answer, but the true answer would require something of an autobiographical account. And so I thought I would do that here. I did not take any notes in preparation for this, so it may well be going back and forth. But I have been thinking about it since I was asked that. It's not that I think my history is of particular interest at all to anybody in the grand scheme of things, but this year I am dedicating myself on this channel to reading things pertaining to China. Right now I am in the midst of The Archaeology of Ancient China by K.C. Chang. And so I may well duplicate some stuff that I've said before as well. But as I say, it was a question that prompted a lot of self-reflection. And I should begin by saying, initially, I am something of a blank slate. I did not have any education per se. I had no inclination in one direction or another. When I was a kid, and you have to remember, I'm in my 60s now, so I am coming from a time before there was an internet, before information was available at one's fingertips. I have much more of a connection to the old world, as we would have called it, than to the new world. And so Asia was not something we even thought about very much. I grew up in a pretty isolated suburb where everybody just about was white. I had one or two good friends who were, I would say, of Mexican descent, but whiteness so permeated the milieu that it never occurred to me or possibly to others. I can't speak for other people. It never occurred to me that there was some sort of difference. One of these kids was the son of a doctor, as it turned out, and another I don't really know, but they were friends. And for 1 or 2 years in, I don't know, second or third grade, we had a classmate who was a little black girl. And this was an age when boys were not really thinking that much about girls. At least I wasn't. So it was something that was not on my radar at all. Now, for all I know, this girl may well have had encounters with the other girls that maybe exhibited some sort of racism or something like that. I was not paying attention, and the fate of this one little girl was not in my consciousness. And we weren't even necessarily in the same class at the same time, because there were 3 different classes of my age level in grammar school. And similarly, I had a couple of classmates. I had one friend who was surnamed Wang, as we said, and we were just friends and never gave any kind of thought that he might have had a kind of heritage that was different to mine. Another friend was surnamed Pai. And so somehow in his case, we were aware And there were a couple of others. There with either a Japanese surname or a Chinese surname. But being a typical oblivious white boy, nothing really penetrated into my ken. I I think most of my youthful years were just a struggle to somehow keep myself going and not be just destroyed by the circumstances of life. That's possibly an exaggeration, but it caused me to have a very introverted sensibility, so I wasn't really thinking about much at all external to myself. In sixth grade, we had to give these little speeches. It was one teacher thought we should each give a speech about something, and one kid who happened to be one of these kids of Hispanic heritage that I mentioned, talked about his experience studying martial arts. And he had gone to some sort of dojo or something in town where he studied some kind of karate, I think it was, something like that. And he talked a little bit about it, that it was sort of like a scientific method where you could learn techniques for fighting that might give you the edge in a situation, possibly. So that stuck in my head. And when I was maybe 16, I started going to, well, I did a number of things. I took classes at college. I started college a little bit early. And so you had a PE requirement. And so they had a judo class, and I had a judo instructor that I really loved. And they had I don't remember if it was, I think it was called Tang Soo Do, but it could have been Hapkido. And it was a very enjoyable class as well. And I satisfied my PE requirements through that. But at that same age, 16, I started going to a place in the next town over called Chung Mu Kwan. And it was a Korean martial art. This book doesn't have any photographs, but it turned out to be something of a religious cult, if you will. It was called Chung Mu Kwan, although it went under different names. It had sites throughout the country and bilked students out of a lot of money. And I had an off and on relationship with this organization. I was born with something of an innate cheapness. And besides, I was working these like restaurant jobs, so I didn't have a lot of free flowing cash to give away, and that was what was expected of you. And the instructors at this martial art really urged me to drop out of school and just get a full-time job so that I could pay money into the organization, and then I could develop and become so much greater. As I say, I never did. I never had both feet in that world. After a hiatus, I went back, and this one guy who had been a newbie when I was there previous was now an instructor, and somebody talked to me and said, it just doesn't seem right that he can advance all these belt levels. Of course, you had to pay for all these tests and stuff. And I think it's because he's the heir to some kind of diamond fortune or whatever, something like this. So eventually I gave it up. And then I was working at a job somewhere else and talking with another a co-worker, and we were friends. He was a Chinese kid, and he was into martial arts. And he said, "Yeah, he knew about this organization as well. They were sort of infamous. I don't think the head figure of the cult ever did any jail time. He might have had some kind of tax consequences, but um, nevertheless, that was closed. But this kid and I were talking, and he said, "There's this real crazy place in Oak Park. It's a martial art, but it's different. It's real slow. They just do it real slow." And he was talking about Tai Chi, and somehow I decided to check it out. And by this point, instead of going to the junior college, I was taking classes at the University of Illinois, Chicago Circle campus, as it was called, where my teacher Paul Carroll taught. And so on the way, I had to pass Oak Park. And so I did check out this school of Tai Chi. Master Liao, turns out, is something of a bigwig in the world of Tai Chi. This book, I think, was one of the best sellers for the publisher Shambhala Press. And I had my friend Marcia, who was something of a mentor, and she had taken classes in San Francisco and talked about Tai Chi a little bit. And I now know the history a little bit better, that there were three, the 70s were a huge martial arts craze phase in the U.S. I think the Bruce Lee movies were coming out, or at least Enter the Dragon, which I think he died before it was released, but it was all big. And so martial arts schools were springing up all over the place. And there was even this whole milieu of people going from one school to the other and challenging the people and so forth. I mean, it's kind of a silly thing, really. And I didn't ever see anything like that at the Tai Chi school, but I heard stories from the old timers who had been there before I was. But I came ultimately to learn, and I don't recall the source, but there were three Tai Chi masters that came to the U.S. One was sent to San Francisco, one was sent to Chicago, and one was sent to New York. Of course, the teacher in New York was Cheng Man Ching, and I thought I had brought his book out here, but I didn't. So you have to trust me on that. He is the most famous of the lot. And nobody knew what any of this stuff was. I mean, now everybody knows all about this stuff. Nobody really understood at the time that it was a serious martial art, and in fact, it was a fighting art. The name means something like the grand ultimate fist, something like that. At least that was how Master Liao would characterize it to us. And so I found it very interesting. The school taught it more as a moving meditation and more a chi cultivation. And there's more to it than that. But it was an art, and it was a full-time practice to those who really were hoping to master it. And of course, that would have been my dream. I was young, and I didn't last all that long. But that's a step on the road. So, after my first year of classes at that school, University of Illinois, Chicago Circle campus, I took a year in the arts program, the arts foundation program. I forget what the real name of it was. I wanted to be an artist, and that taught me that I was not cut out to be an artist, probably. And of course, I was simultaneously beginning to write poetry. But one of my classmates was a young Japanese woman, and summer break was coming up, and she said, "I'm going home. Why don't you come and visit me for a week or 2 weeks, whatever?" And so I thought, okay, yeah. I was not averse to traveling. I mean, in my teen years, I would go down to Mexico. I would take the Greyhound bus, and then I think at Laredo you would switch to Transportes del Norte or Flecha Amarilla, one of those bus lines. I don't think they exist anymore. So I was not averse to traveling. And at the same time, the airlines were offering these round-the-world tickets. Flying all around the globe was a big thing. And so I thought about that. But for some reason, I didn't end up doing that. There was a real great deal, somewhere or other, of a one-way ticket to Singapore. And so that was the ticket I bought, and I got a stopover in Tokyo. So long and short of it was I wound up spending about 9 months in Japan. The visa only got you 6 months, so you had to leave the country and come back. I was staying at youth hostels or guest houses, they would call them. They were not official youth hostels by any means. And there was a whole traveler's circuit. The Lonely Planets book, the yellow one, Southeast Asia on a Shoestring, was big. So there were a lot of travelers, and you would get information from people. So a whole gang of us went to South Korea, took the ferry over, spent a couple of weeks there. It was too cold for me, showering outdoors in December or whatever it was. It must have been before December. I can't remember. Did the obligatory trip to Panmunjom and crossed over into North Korean territory briefly, and then went back to Japan. And then Japan was getting too cold and decided to move on. And in the 9 months in Japan, I was not particularly interested in Japanese culture. But you pick things up. And as I say, prior to that, we wouldn't have known even what's the difference between a Japanese person or a Chinese person, particularly. I think as far as these kids that I went to school with, you knew there was a difference, but you didn't know what that difference consisted of. But spending time in Japan, of course, taught me a few things about Japan, even though I was not doing like a lot of the other travelers, rushing out to temples and I'm sure I did one or two, but that was not my thing. I liked taking the bus. I liked taking the Yamanote line and just doing a perpetual circle for a couple of hours and watching people. I would spend time in Kyoto and then in Tokyo. And some of these travelers were were coming the other way and had spent time in Taiwan. And it sounded very interesting. And especially my curiosity had been raised. And I knew that my teacher, Master Liao, had come from Taiwan. I thought, oh, well, maybe traveling then was more flexible in certain ways. $50, you could get a stopover. Okay, that's what I did. So I stopped over in Taipei and thought I would take up Tai Chi there. Well, I did very little, but it was what Master Liao denigrates as public park Tai Chi. It was not the serious thing. Finding that kind of instructor is not so easy. At least it was not then. And one thing led to another. In high school and in college, I had done pretty well with foreign language classes, Spanish, Italian. I think I even took a class in French. And so I knew from a language standpoint, I was more interested in Chinese than Japanese because it was the older, rather than learn the kanji. Why not go to the source? That was the kind of thinking that I used. So in Taipei, I went to school. There was it was a private school run by the Mandarin Daily News, and they taught classes, monthly classes, and you could learn. And it was an immersion sort of thing. So I did that, and I don't remember how long I was in Taipei before I left, and then I came back, and I went and came back a couple of times. I'm not sure. I would have to look at my old passport if I still have that to tell you the exact dates, and my memory for dates is not that good anyhow. And I think I got a good at least 9 months in two different segments because I had returned home at one point of Chinese language. And of course, I was associating with Chinese friends all the time, going out to illegal Chinese nightclubs. I mean, it was under martial law at the time. But I was just living the life of a young person. And I was there at a time when white people were a rarity there. I went back 10 years later or something, and the number of white people had increased 1,000-fold. And it's increased even more since then. And so the language itself got me interested a little bit in the culture. I would have loved to have become a Chinese scholar. I was at the point where I didn't know what the heck I was going to do with my life. And I have since learned, actually, Casey Chang talks about his studying archaeology, and he says ultimately you have to have some pretty good money behind you to really make a dedicated effort in this field, or else you have to be exceptionally good. And I would really have loved to do that. Now, in that day, things such as Chinese classes were not available in the schools I went to. University of Illinois may have had a Mandarin 101 or something like that. That would have been I forget what it was called, an individual study with a teacher, but there was no sort of program for any of this stuff. Nobody even considered it. And I knew it was interesting, and I enjoyed it. And I don't remember if I wrote home or if it was on one of those rare telephone calls. You could hardly ever get a telephone call through. I mean, it was a big ordeal to do, and it was very costly. We mailed airgrams. And I asked my parents, I said, I would really like to dedicate myself to this. And I would like, would you consider supporting my way so that I could go to school full time and really learn this stuff? And they, I guess, talked about it or something, but ultimately the answer came back no. They weren't willing to do that. And so at some point I quit taking the classes because in order to support myself, I had to have night classes teaching English, and I didn't like the job. I'm not a teacher. If you watch this channel, you'll know I don't teach at all. And so I wound up working for a trading company, which was a full-time job, 8 hours or whatever, but it was fine. I mean, I was young, but I quit doing the studying at that time. And now that I know in retrospect, at any rate, it was just as well. I knew when I decided to come home that if I but gave it 3 more years, I would be perfectly fluent in Chinese, and then I could write my own ticket, so to speak. I knew I would have a lot of options available to me. Now, in this day, I don't know how much people back home were thinking about China, but just by sheer accident, I was in this position, and so I was thinking about it. Ultimately, it worked out for the best because when I went home, I continued devoting myself to poetry and had a host of other experiences which were pivotal or critical to my future work in poetics. And even if I had studied all that stuff and become fluent, there wouldn't have been a job for me as a scholar. I know that now. And the only thing that would have been available to me would have been some kind of position in business. A lot of options probably would have opened up, and I was aware of this. But the last thing in the world that I was or would be interested in was business. As E. E. Cummings said, the only thing that I would be interested about making money would be the actual making of it. I mean, I'm trying to paraphrase him, and he was making kind of a coy joke, but it was not where I was interested in heading. And then to further accumulate things, since I've been back, and now I understand that for the whole literary aspect of it, Cantonese would be the Chinese you would want to study because that is much more akin to the traditional Chinese language. Of course, you would have to go to Taiwan to learn how to write it the correct way. But barbaric Mandarin would not be the language you would want to speak, to read the poems and all of that. Now, I should also add that not everybody speaks Mandarin with the harsh, grating sounds that they do in Beijing, and particularly in Taiwan. There's a very nice mellifluous tone to the language. But so you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just may find you get what you need. So I got back to the United States and did my life. And at some point, I thought, well, I should try to keep my language up. I should try to do something like that. And I did some volunteer work at a social service agency in Chicago. I also went back to Master Liao's school in Oak Park. It was a bus ride, a long bus ride. Got attacked one time. And through the convergence of both of those, I met the woman who has been my partner now for 20 years or so. And she is Chinese, born in a village in China to a man that was born in Chicago, one of the real old Chinese families here. And of course, we speak in English together, and when we go to China, I speak in Mandarin, and she is better at reading the signs. And of course, one of the aspects to the life we live now is I've had a much more thorough introduction to different aspects of Chinese cuisine. And of course, that was a fortunate break that I went as a young man to Taiwan. And everybody at the time said, this is ROC, Republic of China. That's what they said. And so that was the mindset I took, this is China. I was too afraid to go to the mainland at the time, and I could tell you stories about what kind of things went on there. While in Taiwan, for a brief while, a friend of mine had a friend who had been in the mainland and told stories about his time there. And then, just as a person curious about the world, I would go to the bookstores and just pick up what interested me. I mean, I would go to the library and pick up things that interested me. Back then, the library was not as bad as it became after Mary Dempsey got her hands on it and wrung its neck, so to speak, the Chicago Public Library. And if I found something, and this is even before my Chicago time, when I was still a suburban kid with my parents, I found this at a public library and just read it, and it was interesting. I never knew any of this history. I was a kid, I didn't know anything, and so I was curious, and I'm hoping to reread this one of these days, but that you learn a little something and it sparks your interest. And then, of course, books I picked up in Taiwan. I read a little bit from The Man Who Sold a Ghost. Very nice book. I read a little bit of this guy, Pu Song Lin. I am not quite sure how to say it. And back then, of course, the Penguin complete edition was not available. I have it somewhere. I haven't. I've thought about reading it, but I was never a strong reader, and now that I am becoming stronger at reading, I have a whole backlog of things. But in those days, I would just pick up things at the store. I was interested in Africa, and this was about the only history I could find of Africa, and there were a lot of books by Basil Davidson, and I gradually picked up some of those. But there wasn't a lot of stuff on Africa. There just wasn't. And there was not much stuff on China. And I showed this was the first K.C. Chang book that I picked up. And I read it. I was interested. I wanted to learn. But it was well beyond me. And so it is now this year's reading program entails quite a bit of reading books that have a connection to K.C. Chang. Archaeology and anthropology are not my strong suit, but I'm going to do it because I have the books. And after this year passes, I may go somewhere else. The really key author that I read last year was Mark Edward Lewis, his 3 books in the Harvard Imperial China series. And that actually, for the first time in my life, gave me a full sense of a period of Chinese history. Otherwise, before that, it's just all been murky. I've never been able to figure any of it out. And so I'm starting to. And then with that, I decided, well, I might as well go back and read all of this stuff, even though it's hard reading. I should say on one of those trips back while I was still a suburban dude, I got a job working at a Chinese restaurant in town. It was actually not a Chinese restaurant. It was a Korean restaurant masquerading as a Chinese restaurant. And they had the luncheon specials, the typical thing with the egg rolls. And they served the customers Chinese food, but we, the staff, had a meal either before or after the shift, I think usually after. And of course, it would be Korean food. And my having spent time in Korea just let me be open to that as well. Now I don't know that a Korean restaurant would masquerade itself as a Chinese restaurant. And I don't think they really lied about it. I think good customers or whatever knew, because they knew who the proprietors were. They were a good lot of people, a good, decent sort. One time we were in France somewhere near the Mont Saint-Michel, and we stayed at a B&B with a French woman who was married to a guy who she thought was Vietnamese, and we we found out he was Chinese. So I mean, in the old world, people were more loosey-goose, and it didn't even matter really. I mean, my one of my ancestors was an Italian, and some Italian guy went to Bohemia, and after a generation or whatever, he was Czech. So it's a surname that just kind of is incongruous with some of the others, but it's Czech. And throughout my interest in poetry, of course, I would find things like this occasionally. This is a great book about Chinese poetry, and I really would like to revisit I have all of his books that were available. I just can't find all of them. And I would like to revisit that. But I have other things on my plate because I'm interested in poetry, I'm interested in language. And the thing that sets something such as China ahead of, say, some other place is that it has this great literary tradition. And just now, actually, stuff is coming to be translated. But as Moses Finley said, literary evidence is the hardest to refuse. And as a sort of literary-minded soul myself, I'm very interested in that aspect, and where it comes down to a historical tradition based on, say, oral traditions and that kind of thing, folk tales and myths retold. None of that interests me very much. So I'm very much literary minded, and um, China presents a wealth of that kind of stuff. 20 years ago, I think I went and I found this series of books, and it was very sporadic that you would find them in bookstores, but it had the bilingual text. And I was seriously thinking about trying to work on my Chinese. I am at a level where I really don't need any particular schooling or anything. I can teach myself at this point, and I had begun to do so and got sick and had also an injury, which I can't really hold a writing implement for long. And I had been really practicing the writing, and that came to a stop after that. And at this point, as you grow older, one by one, your ambitions fall away. I will occasionally pursue, say, a piece of Korean literature as reading material, Japanese stuff, but because I have the little bit of Chinese language background and now the little bit of sort of Chinese lived experience, a little bit, because I have been on the periphery of people who speak Chinese in one form or another most of my adult life, it just tends to be the way my interests take me. But again, it's not as though I am interested in Chinese culture to the exclusion of anything else. And far be it from that. Any sort of different turn in the road, if I had taken bus number 409 instead of 208, everything would have gone a different way. And so that, I think, is the biography or autobiography that would answer the question that I got. So it is not that, I mean, if I, for some reason, was able to move back to either Taipei or some city in China, I'm sure I would take things up. When you learn a foreign language, and because of the nature of the classes we had, it was an immersion thing. It was not the kind of way we studied Italian or Spanish. There was no translation involved. So in a sense, even though I speak like a 2-year-old or something like that, in a sense, I have a second native tongue. So I'm very weak and can do very little with it. And after 40 years of growing rusty, all of it's out of whack. But were I to have the opportunity, and it's not going to come, I believe, I would avail myself of it, and I would probably give up the English language even if I could. One thing that learning to speak another language does is it makes you realize how false a lot of your ideological conceptions are. Just every little thing that you take for granted, in front, behind, just all of these weird grammatical constructions that we have in the languages that, say, derive from Latin or what we have in the West, where it would be wrong to say something like, I eat a cake yesterday. Most languages, I think, operate that way. What I loved about Chinese was you just said what you wanted to say. You didn't have to think to make verbs and nouns agree. You didn't have tenses. You didn't have all of that stuff. You just said what you wanted. And for me, that actually would be a relief. I mean, I am a writer of poetry in the English language tradition. And so I've accepted that mantle throughout my adult life. But I have retired from that largely and don't owe any special allegiance to the English language at this time. And if I could, certainly I would be happy to give it up. I knew even then I could do so. But it's unlikely that that will happen. And I grow old. I grow old and shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled, as it were. And when I say I needed 3 more years to speak Chinese fluently, of course, I'm talking about what you needed on the streets, getting around, just conversing with people. If you're talking about literature, that kind of thing, you need a lot more. Some of my lived experience since would actually help me in that, were I to go that route now. But there is too much conspiring against it. And there is a lot to recommend the study of Chinese culture, language. It is the rising superpower in the world today. It contains a huge portion of the world's population. China does. And it's got a sophisticated history, a history that goes back. I was thinking about Linear B and how it was used basically for inventory keeping. And you go back to the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty, and you look at the origins of writing in China, I don't think you can say that they are explicitly inventory taking. I don't know enough at this point, but the oracle bones and all of that, I mean, writing started there and beseeching answers from the gods or whatever. I really, as I say, I'm speaking out of the wind here, but they had a huge, sophisticated culture at a time when nobody else did, and for long periods of time. And just as a human being, it is a culture worth reckoning with. And again, it has the advantage of positing a different pole, so to speak. When I was in school, I liked the fact that you could take a class in Italian and, it was so close to Spanish, you just had to know the different, the analogous endings, but the basic framework was the same. But there you're using cognates galore, and the cognates won't be exact, but they're still close enough. Whereas learning a different language takes you out of yourself and puts you into a different self. And that is probably what I miss most about speaking Chinese. And yes, if I could, I would go back and do it. But as I say, you can't always get what you want. And so I just go about my course. And so this year I'm focusing on trying to bone up on my Chinese history because I never had any of it. And the books were not particularly easy to come by. this set of 3 books by Mark Edward Lewis has been a godsend for me. And after this year is up, as I say, who knows? Maybe I will read the Greek and Roman historians. But I don't see any real need to pin myself down to one focus or another. This is just a phase I'm going through, and next year it may be something else. But I have a backlog of materials that I've picked up over the years. And part of what I'm trying to do as I try to become a better reader is to just go through some of these things that I've picked up just out of curiosity and see where that leads me. So I will leave this off here. I've been a bit silent of late because I'm just reading a few things. I'm not all over the place, and I'm not having any thoughts, as Richard Feynman said, or his son said, my word bag has been empty. But there's nothing like a little bit of talking about one's self to lubricate the old vocal cords. So we'll see if this leads into any more videos imminently. Anyhow, thank you for stopping by my channel. And to you, the viewer who asked the question, thank you for asking the question. I think most booktubers are flattered, honored, and happy to receive questions and do our best to answer them. I mean, it's really sweet, actually, that anybody wants to know something like that. So I will leave off here. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.